Welcome back. This is the 1960s part two. We left off talking about President Johnson and how he obviously took office after President Kennedy's assassination. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Johnson administration. In the first few months of his administration, he definitely wanted to continue Kennedy's plans, right? Again, the nation was really shocked and saddened by Kennedy's death, and so he really wanted to commit to kind of continuing Kennedy's plan. So one example of that would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is something that Kennedy had called for in the month just before he was assassinated, and so Johnson really made it a priority to get that done. It was really difficult because he had to work with a lot of the Southern Democrats, um, to get that law passed. When he wins the next term here in 1964, he won, re-election essentially. He is going to take this as his first real term. And so he's going to launch this so-called war on poverty. And this is going to be his major domestic policy priority. One thing that really influenced this was this book called The Other America. It was written in 1962 by Michael Harrington, and it became this really big bestseller, and it was about poverty in the United States and basically revealed that about a fifth of the population, or 20% of Americans, lived in poverty. And this was really shocking to a lot of people because we had been experiencing this really long post World War II economic boom where everyone was really prospering, incomes were increasing, more and more people were moving into the middle class and buying homes. But this book really revealed that there was a sizable portion of Americans that were left out of that literally lived in poverty, did not have running water or electricity or some of those basic things that most Americans considered, important. And so he's going to launch this war on poverty, and he's going to call his plans the Great Society. And it's basically his plan to bring this kind of post-war prosperity to all. The idea is kind of continuing the New Deal. You can think of the Great Society as the New Deal plus civil rights. And so Johnson is going to work with Congress to pass a series of laws to address a whole bunch of stuff, including civil rights, voting rights, poverty, education, healthcare, environmental concerns, and urban renewal. And all of this, like I said, is called the Great Society. So some examples of the laws and programs created here with the Great Society in 1964. The Economic Opportunity Act provided millions of dollars in funding for new programs to combat the causes of poverty. So a good example of that is the Head Start program. It's an educational program that provides preschool and healthcare and nutrition services for low income children. The idea is if we can get students very young, get kids very young, get them into preschool, get them healthy, get them, food, nutrition, that we can give them a head start at being successful in life, and that is going to stop some of these root causes of poverty, because a student, a child that gets early education, is healthy, is well fed, is going to be more successful in the long run and is less likely to be in poverty. In 1965, we see the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. This created programs to renew urban areas and also provide low-income housing. And then the big one in 1965, we see the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. So these are health insurance programs, basically for the elderly. Medicare is for the elderly, Medicaid is for the poor. And this is funded by the federal government through payroll taxes. So it's very similar to like the Social Security program. And you can see these programs are what take up the vast majority of federal spending. You can see pretty much half of the total federal spending comes from what we call these entitlement programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. All right, so it's a huge increase in the size and power of the federal government, just like we saw with Social Security during the New Deal. Medicare and Medicaid are really adding to that. In addition, we also see the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965. This eliminated that quota system that we had enacted back in the 1920s. So we don't have quotas anymore based on country of origin. We now have a system based on family relations and also skill. And so you can see this had a huge effect on immigration, and it dramatically changed our immigration patterns. You can see here, this is kind of the height of immigration, right? During the turn of the 20th century, where we have millions of mostly European immigrants. And then that's severely limited here in the 20s with the quota system, right? And then right here is when we see the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965. And so we see this huge uptick in the number of immigrants. And we also start to see changes, right? Traditionally, Europe has been the major source of immigration to the US. Now we see a lot more from Asia and Latin America, right? So China, Japan, the Philippines, right? And Latin America, certainly like Mexico and other Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, places like that, all right? One issue that we have here, though, is the Great Society is really going to come at the expense of the Vietnam War. The money that could have been spent on this war on poverty was spent fighting communism. And this really becomes the problem of the Cold War. You can't fully fund domestic programs when you're constantly in war. And you can kind of see that here's Johnson's Great Society being pulled down by foreign policy. And we'll talk more about the Vietnam War in a later lecture. And this later becomes a issue that we deal with today, right? With our war on terror, we spend so much money on defense that we can't fully fund domestic programs, all right? Switching gears a little bit, I do want to talk about society and culture in the 1960s. What we see is the civil rights movement, and the success we see with the civil rights movement is going to set up other protest movements. So women are going to start to protest. Gay people are going to start to protest. We see other minority groups like Latin Americans, Chicano workers, Cesar Chavez, and farm workers. They led a big protest movement. Native Americans as well. One of the big things too is going to be the Vietnam War. This increasingly is going to escalate in the 1960s and have a big social impact. We'll start to see a lot of anti-war demonstrations, anti-draft protests as well. And we'll talk about that more in a later lecture. We also see the environmental movement grow. One thing that really set this off was this book here, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It was published in 1962 and really brought a lot of attention to the dangers, the health dangers, environmental dangers of pollution. And we see groups like Friends of the Earth and the Environmental Defense Fund being founded during this time period. Lots of protests, and the environmental movement grows significantly. We also see this counterculture movement, as many young people, these big group of baby boomers, are now entering into adolescence. They're becoming teenagers. As teenagers like to do, they like to rebel, against their parents. And that's really what we see here, this counterculture in the 1960s that rejects traditional ideas and values and authorities. It's very much a backlash to the previous generation, the conformity of the 50s, what was going on with the Cold War, this threat of nuclear annihilation. The Vietnam War is especially playing a role. And these so-called hippies really kind of buck the trends, buck the norms. They experiment with drugs, have more open attitudes about sex and gender roles. They're going to be very, very influential, in arts and music and fashion and movies. And it's very much symbolized by the very famous Woodstock Music Festival, which took place in the summer of 1969, where hundreds of thousands of young people, these hippies, these counterculture, members gathered for 3 days of peace and music. All right, guys, we're going to end there. That was 1960s part two.